With me, I'm joined by the federal Deputy Labor Leader, that is Richard Marles. He's the member for Corio, a Victorian, a proud Victorian. You know this area very well, Richard Marles. You must be sad to observe what we're seeing this afternoon.
Yes, Kieran, looking at the pictures on the screen, I find this really disturbing. As you rightly say, the Shrine of Remembrance is one of the most sacred places in the country. It was commissioned after the First World War, and it commemorates an extraordinary amount of sacrifice of Australians. And it's a meeting place every year on Anzac Day to remember them. And the thing that occurs to me is that, of course, those veterans, those who've served, those who want to commemorate that sacrifice have actually not been able to do this at the Shrine of Remembrance over the last couple of years because of what we've faced with the pandemic. And so the idea that this crowd is there in circumstances where those who want to honour that sacrifice have not been able to be there, I think is really disturbing. And I'd condemn this crowd. Firstly, there's no place for violence in Australian public debate. What the protests are seeking, what their message is, which is really to undermine confidence in the public health orders of the Victorian government, to undermine confidence in the vaccine and its rollout, couldn't be more damaging and couldn't be more wrong. They're not solving any of the problems that we face as a society. They're just making matters absolutely worse. I think Victorians are really appalled at what they've seen over the last few days. Governments need to be able to make public health orders in the interests of the public health of in this case, the Victorian community. And what we've seen from these protesters is indulgent and it's deeply selfish.
Given how much Victorians and Melburnians have sacrificed during the pandemic, how much does it frustrate you that we appear to be so close to the end game in terms of getting those vaccination rates to the right level and so on, that this flashpoint, this fraying of the social compact that we've had with our leaders and community, that this flashpoint has happened when we are so close to the end in terms of reaching those thresholds?
Well, I think the social compact is still there for the vast bulk of Victorians. I think we're looking at people on the fringes here, and it is very frustrating looking at their behaviour. And as I say, I think their behaviour is both indulgent and selfish, and it doesn't help. Is it just the fringe? In fact, it makes matters
worse. Is it just the fringe, or because let's be realistic about it though, because I know there are fringe elements, but there are also, the last few days, there've been members of the construction industry as well frustrated. Their industry was shut down for 2 weeks without any notice. You do concede that, don't you?
Look, I fundamentally think that what we're seeing here are fringe elements. I make the point that, to the extent that we've seen violence in the last few days, there is no place for that at all. And the construction unions themselves have been supporting the efforts of the Victorian government to see their industry vaccinated. And I think people can understand that in circumstances where we've seen a lot of cases within the construction sector, the Victorian government has difficult decisions to make, but they have an absolute right and a responsibility to make them, to make public health orders in the interests of the Victorian community. And that's all they've done. Look, we don't want to see an extra day of lockdown than we have to in Victoria. And Victorians, you're right, have endured a lot in the last 15, 16 months. And we do want to see us move down a path where we get to the other side and we find normality. And almost every Victorian in enduring that understands the process and wants us to get there. But the only game in town, Kieran, here is getting vaccinated. That's what we have to do. That's what the pathway is to opening up. That's what the pathway is to getting to the other side. That's what's the pathway to seeing normality return to Victoria. And that's what we have to do. And actually, these protesters, really their message stands in stark contrast to all of that, which is why it is so indulgent and so selfish.
But just to go back to that question though, because my colleagues, our correspondents on the ground there covering the protests have said that there is still a decent cohort involved that are from the construction sector. So you're saying they're fringe elements, but my colleague is saying that it's 50% construction still.
Well, all I can say is that the peak bodies in the construction sector are working together responsibly, understand the very difficult decisions that face the Victorian government, and want to see their sector vaccinated, and have been doing everything they can to encourage that. So, I don't think, and more to the point, have condemned these protests. I mean, that's where those peak bodies have been at, including the CFMEU. So, that's who I look to speak for the construction sector, both the CFMEU, organisations like the Master Builders, peak bodies in the sector, not what we're seeing on the streets in Melbourne right now. And I don't agree with their message. I think it's a message which takes us in completely the wrong direction, and I really profoundly disagree with their method.
My colleague Julia Bradley spoke to a military veteran of 20 years who described what he was seeing there as an absolute disgrace, and said that those people on the steps don't deserve to be holding the Australian flag. What do you say in reflecting on that?
I completely agree. I totally agree. And I really feel for the veterans for whom Anzac Day is so important, as it is for the whole country, but particularly veterans. It is our Veterans Day. Who have not been able to march in Anzac Day parades over the last couple of years because of the pandemic. This is where they would have gathered because of the significance and the sacredness of this ground. And the idea that it's now being occupied by this group with this message in this way, I think is an absolute disgrace. And I completely agree with the proposition. There's nothing Australian about this at all. It totally dishonours our history, and no one who is there could in any reasonable way comprehend what that building is about and the kind of sacrifice that we've seen in our nation.
So how does the Andrews government now take the heat out of this situation? How do they try and avoid the crisis? And do you reject any notion that the industry-wide ban of construction played a part in inflaming it?
Well, I think the industry-wide ban is a decision that we need to support. We've seen a whole lot of cases in the construction industry. And what underpins that decision is the right of a government to make public health orders in the interests of the Victorian community in this case. We need to be supporting the ability of government to lead us through this, because without that, we don't get to the other side. Now, I think the Victorian government are sincerely acting on the basis of the best medical advice. That's all you can ask them to do. And from there to make the decisions that they need to make, which are in the interests of the community as a whole, which again is what they're doing. They're difficult decisions. No one in construction would want it, obviously, and we all don't want it. But it's a consequence of the pandemic. It's a consequence of where the disease is, and these are the sorts of difficult decisions that governments need to make. But at this moment in time, we need to be supporting governments in leading us through this.
Does it extend to the mandatory vaccination? Because we're hearing again from those images, people yelling freedom of choice. That's what they're chanting, freedom of choice. They don't want to get vaccinated.
It does extend to mandatory vaccination. It does. And it's really important, again, that governments have the right to make public health orders of that kind in the interests of our community. Now, we have seen that already in relation to a number of industries in aged care, for example. We're now seeing it in respect of our schools. We've seen it in schools in New South Wales. And that's the decision that the Victorian government's made in the context of construction, given the way in which the disease has spread in recent times and the risks that are posed in terms of the disease spreading throughout that sector. They're doing it on the basis of the best medical advice. And it's important that government is able to do this. Now, I'd go a step further and I'd say that I think it's really important ultimately that we see national leadership on the question of vaccine policy, particularly in the workplace. It really matters that we have workplaces which are safe for those who work at them, safe for those who interact with them, if we're talking about retail outlets. And it can't be a matter which is left up to individual businesses. It must be something where government sets the lead. I actually think at the end of the day, it's a matter for the federal government to lead. But in this instance, where the Victorian government have made this call, I think it's actually really important that we are supporting that call and supporting the right of government to make it, because the alternative is an impossible situation where matters of these kind are left to individual businesses, where we actually don't get to the other side and get to an orderly situation beyond COVID-19. One of the things that the pandemic has actually made very clear is that, as people, we're bound together. That's actually how the virus spreads, but as people, we are bound together. We are one society and one community, and we have responsibilities to each other. And that's, part of why these decisions are so important. It's why it's important that government leads the way here. But it's why, in this instance, I think it's completely appropriate that the Victorian government have made the call they have in terms of mandatory vaccines in this sector.